Hi, everyone. Welcome to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and I really appreciate you joining me today. So, the show, I hope, is a place for you to take some time, bring your attention and awareness to the present moment, maybe relax into this moment, and allow yourself to find places in your experience that resonate with the topics that I talk about, so that you can, like me, on a mindfulness journey, be deepening your understanding of yourself as you become a student of your own mind, your own heart, your own body. My topics are intended to support people in their journey towards greater mindfulness. And mindfulness, as I say in the intro, is bringing our attention and awareness to the present moment without judgment. That actually, I always want to emphasize, I find to be the hardest part. Present, attention, awareness, present moment, I can get there without judgment, much tougher nut to crack. And it does sound like a simple goal, but it can be difficult to achieve. But its value is that mindfulness, when we practice it, can bring greater peace into our lives. And when we have greater peace internally, we are a force for peace in the world. And we live in a world that needs that from each and every one of us. So that's why I practice it, and I hope that you'll join me in that. For today's show, for each show, I post a little photograph. If you go and find the show at Transformation Talk Radio and look at the archives, you'll see each show has a little photograph next to it. And one of my hobbies that I don't know if it counts as a hobby because that makes it sound like I'm trying to get better at it. I just like to take pictures, and I hope they're not terrible. So today's picture, though, is one of my favorites. It was taken in April 2018. My partner and I were in a park just outside of Amsterdam. This was it's called Keukenhof is the name of the park, and it is a place I had wanted to visit for a very long time. And it was a nearly perfect day. We had gone to Amsterdam for the purpose of finding this park, going to this park and spending the day there. Because as many of us know, the Dutch are associated with tulips. And Keukenhof Park is a park that is only open for about 8 to 10 weeks, I think, in the springtime. And it is overflowing with tulip gardens. There's also a lot of hyacinth and daffodils, but really tulips are the main attraction. Although in this particular picture, it looks like kind of a river of purple hyacinth with daffodils and tulips on the borders, on the banks of this beautiful purple river. And what I like about the picture is the intensity of the color, the way that it just fills up the picture, and you can see some kind of pretty green trees in the very far background, the way it kind of mirrors a river. And to me, it is the symbol of that incredible day. Spring is usually a difficult time for us to travel because of the work we do. So this was a huge opportunity to go and say, we're going to travel in the spring. We're going to go and do this. And we got there early. We're early birds. So we were there when the park first opened, maybe the second bus to come in. So that meant that the first, I would say 30 minutes at least that we were in the park, we were almost by ourselves. We took all sorts of pictures where there's no people. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, it was wall to wall people, and we stayed all day. We brought a picnic lunch. We didn't fuss with each other about anything. We were a little disappointed in the stuff in the gift shop. We're Americans. We expected really massive gift shops, and we only bought a couple of things, but it was just a perfect day. So now I live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest, and it turns out that and you people in Michigan are going to be annoyed by this, but really the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, Northern Washington State, is the tulip bulb capital of the United States. A vast number, I can't remember the percentage, but a ridiculous percentage of tulips that are planted in the US come from this region of the country, particularly north of Seattle. So of course, my partner and I had to visit this place where there are these wonderful tulip fields. And I thought I was being very clever, and I said to her, wouldn't it be great if we could go during the week? Because of course, I think in general, this area is very crowded on because it's so beautiful to see the tulips, but because of COVID and people finally getting to be out, there's the intensity, the outdoor activities are really crowded. So I said, let's go during the week. Is there any chance that would work? And she said, yeah, she could do it. She could do it. So the night before, we were getting ready, and we realized that a house project that some people are doing for us had a problem, and that we were going to have to talk to the people in the morning about it, and we weren't really sure we were going to be able to, how quickly we'd be able to get to it, and how easily it would be explained, and whether or not there would be a conflict about it. And that we really needed to leave early in the morning because the tulip fields are about 2 hours away, and we have to go through Seattle to get there back and forth, and she needed to be home by 6 o'clock and couldn't have to leave by 3 o'clock again. I mean, okay, it was way too much. And so we said, we're not going to go today. We'll try and go on the weekend. Now, I just want to say I have had a lot of personal growth in the last 2 years, and here's my evidence for that. I did not lose my cool over it. It did not ruin my day. I did not spend the rest of the day feeling as if I was being punished over something over which I had no control, that I hadn't done anything wrong, but that suddenly this thing I really wanted to do, this near perfect day I wanted to recreate, had been taken away from me, and I didn't feel that way at all. It didn't overshadow the rest of my day. We were able to work on the house project, and it got done pretty quickly, but still we would have had a very rushed time. So we skipped the trip to Mount Vernon. And I was really, really surprised at myself. And it actually didn't even completely dawn on me until much later in the day that I'd gotten through the day without that heavy weight of disappointment, that this thing I had had this deep desire to do had been scuttled. It just sort of rolled off. And of course, my grown-up mind knows that it's childish thinking that, but the reality is that for many of us, the desires we experience as grown-ups can be traced back to feelings of emptiness that we had in childhood. And that feeling of disappointment, of maybe something being held out as a possibility and then taken away, or the desire to recreate a near perfect experience, those are things that I can remember from a really long time back. But I did not on this particular day cling to that desire, and I was delighted. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about aversion. And it's one of what the Buddhists call the three root hindrances to insight. One of the three things that gets in the way and keeps us from achieving insight in our daily life is aversion. They're also called the three defilements. And Sharon Salzberg explains that these three habits, one is aversion that I've already talked about, grasping, which I'm going to talk about today, and then delusion. And Salzberg says, these are the mind's way of getting in the way of itself, and that we tend to have a misplaced or distorted trust when we are in that space of aversion, grasping, or delusion. And so aversion is the turning away from or rejection of something we think we don't want. Grasping or clinging is to something we think we do want. And as the editors of Tricycle magazine write, delusion, the third one, is the folly of thinking we can get what we want to the exclusion of what we don't want. So we're going to talk more about delusion next week, but this week I really want to focus our attention on grasping. And so I want you to be thinking about these questions. Where, to what, and to whom do we cling in our lives? What are some examples in your life where you notice that you cling to people, to experiences, to feelings? Second, you might ask yourself, what parts of you feel empty? And what are you doing to try to fill that void? Where is that hollow space? And what is the thing that you think might fill that space? And then when and where and with whom do we find ourselves experiencing greed or jealousy? Who's that person in your life? What's the relationship? What's the experience where suddenly that green-eyed monster of jealousy rears up and you just want what you want because it's so maddening that the other person has it? Or where greed, where you just feel a kind of insatiable, I must have more of whatever the thing is. So that's what we're going to talk about today, this quality. It's basically what the Buddhists talk about a lot, which is desire, but in particular, this note this aspect of desire that is a clinging to and a grasping of something in our life. So we're going to breathe, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about grasping. So if you would breathe with me, we're just going to do the one where we put our hands over our head and out and all that stuff. So we bring our hands to heart center. Inhale. Push our palms forward. Exhale. Raise our hands above our head. Inhale. Take our hands down to the side. Exhale. One more time. Third time. Okay. We breathe so that we can bring attention to our focus, our minds, and bring attention to our bodies and really be in the present moment. And so we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about one of the 3 hindrances to insight, which is grasping. You're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and today we're talking about grasping, or one of the 3 hindrances to insight. And Jack Kornfield writes about this in a way that I think is really helpful. He says, and of course for Buddhists, grasping is a part of desire, and desire is I think a more common word in some ways. I think grasping is a way to operationalize desire. But so he talks about desire, and he reminds us what I think is very important, that there are beneficial desires, right? Such as the desire for the well-being of others, the desire for awakening, the creative desires that express the positive aspects of passion and beauty. But then, of course, he writes, there are the painful aspects of desire, the desires of addiction, the desires of greed, blind ambition, or an unending inner hunger. And that's what I was asking you to think about during the break and to be thinking about during this show. What are those places in your life where maybe there is a kind of emptiness and inner hunger? What are you trying to fill it with? What are the places in your life where you may experience jealousy or greed? What are the places in your life where you're clinging to something, to an idea, to a relationship, to a way of life that maybe is no longer working for you, but all the alternatives seem much worse? And it can also be a clinging to a feeling. This is kind of the classic of addiction, right? If the addiction is to drugs or alcohol, we talk about people chasing a high, right? They talk about heroin that way, that the first time is always the best, and that a heroin addict spends the rest of their experience as an addict chasing that first high. But that can be a metaphor, of course, for many things in our life where we're chasing that feeling, right? The feeling of falling in love that we may be constantly chasing throughout our lives because it's at the early stage, it's so great, and then reality sets in. And but so we are always kind of after that feeling. So when I think about grasping, 2 people come to mind in my own life, a former sister-in-law and my mother. And they were very much alike in one particular way, which was their conviction that other people's lives were better than their lives. There was a kind of deep-seated jealousy that they experienced that was very painful for them. They couldn't look at a loved one, a relative, a close friend, a coworker, without some part of their brain, it seems like, turning immediately to comparison. How is my life worse off than their life? They have a better husband, their children are this, their job is that. That comparison and finding themselves wanting and being jealous of what other people had was almost like a filter through which they saw the world. And that's part of the challenge of this experience of grasping, is that it can become a filter through which we see and judge and evaluate and assess every aspect of our lives. I feel like I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to grab a Kleenex just in case that happens. So when, on the show in general, we've talked a lot about kind of mindsets that can be problematic, that get in the way of ourselves and happiness or contentment or a feeling of peace. And a lot of them can be seen as expressions of desire or grasping. Certainly, it's often based in comparison. Right. If I'm feeling greedy, it's I'm wanting to have more than others. If I'm feeling jealous, it's that I'm concerned that others have more than me. There's also judgment, right? Immediately in that comparison, there's judgment of somebody has less, somebody has more, somebody's better, somebody's worse. I think underneath it can often be a striving for control, right? When I want to hold on to a feeling, I want this feeling to last forever. And, you're just kind of a fist choking the life out of that feeling. But it's maybe a desire for control. And of course, I think it can be a real lack of self-acceptance, that what we have is never really enough or good enough. I was talking recently with a client who, a new relationship client, and so he was telling me about a relationship in his life, a person he has been living with for many months, and he described as his partner, but his description was very, very positive. Told me all these positive things about this person, about their life together, about the way that they got along, how they interacted. But he kept using interesting phrases, and he would say, he's great on paper, as if he only existed on paper. But my sister says, sometimes you just have to settle. He said, I just have this nagging feeling. This client was really struggling with, I think, a kind of grasping, because then he said to me, I realize, of course, that there are very few relationships that are blissful, that are perfect. And I said, that's really interesting. Name 3 people in your life that who have that blissful relationship you're talking about. Of course, I was being kind of mean, because he said, okay, I don't know anybody who has a blissful relationship. He said, I know people who have better relationships than others. I said, I'll grant you that. But blissful. But interesting idea, right? In his mind, he can picture a blissful relationship. It's perfect on all counts, right? Sexual desire is perfect. Compatibility and things that we like, perfect. Aspirations and the way that they fit together, perfect. How we like to live, what we like to do with our time, do we make each other laugh, right? Every single quality is perfect, and that's bliss to him. And of course, right, that's what the movies look like. That's what the novels write about sometimes. So it's not surprising that he might have that image in his head to which he is clinging, and which he is using to compare this thing, this bliss that he knows doesn't even actually really exist. At least he can't think of an example of it in the real world, but that's a kind of measure by which he is evaluating his current relationship. And so even though the current relationship is great in so many ways, he devalues it a little by saying, well, it's great on paper, that my partner's great on paper. He devalues it when he says, well, my sister says sometimes you have to settle. Trying to find a way to both kind of, I don't know exactly have it all, but in that mental sense, right, of that kind of critical demon voice, always looking for trouble, right? He can see all the positives in his relationship. He can know that he's clinging to this idea of bliss that is unrealistic, but that demon voice keeps coming in and saying, yeah, but, it could be better, it could be better, it could be better. Or as Jack Cornfield would say, the voice of wanting, what is here now is never enough. And so I'd ask you to be thinking about that, of what are those ways in which, and it can be large or small, but that what is here now is never enough. And I would add maybe never quite good enough, never quite, that there's always some room for not just improvement in that sense of, yeah, it's good to make the world a better place and our lives better, but where are we in that habit, the mental habit of always finding what we have to be lacking? It's never quite good enough. It's never quite enough. And then, of course, we want to turn that around, because as I said before, I think part of grasping, underlying that habit of grasping, is the lack of self-acceptance. So if for the voice of wanting, what is here now is never enough, is it also the case that for the voice of wanting, what I am right now is never enough. Also very challenging to think about. So as I mentioned before, there's the Tricycle magazine, so a lovely magazine, and they wrote a great editorial about the three defilements, or aversion, grasping, and delusion. And a point that they made, and I'll talk more about this next week, is that grasping and aversion are part of the same thing, right? If I'm clinging to something, they write, my clinging to something I want is always in resistance to something I don't want, right? So the two are kind of paired together. And I was thinking about this when I was talking to a friend who is, she's facing challenges at work and at home and with her extended family. She feels that everywhere she turns, others are expecting her to do more and to be more, to have endless energy and strength and clarity. And she's exhausted, she says, by other people's demands. She said, everyone expects me to be superhuman. So here in her example, or her experience, I think shows how aversion and clinging work together. So the aversion is this sensation she has that other people expect her to be superhuman really expresses itself in an aversion towards that expectation. So she feels anger towards others, and she's convinced that they're judging her. Not only do they expect her to be superhuman, but they are simultaneously always finding her wanting, right? So there is real aversion that she feels towards that. And there's a lot of frustration, as I say, anger, and really unpleasant experience. But so where's the clinging? So if the aversion is to her perception of other people's expectations, I would wonder if the clinging is to a self-image that says she must exceed other people's expectations of her in order to be an acceptable. I knew I was eventually going to sneeze. Sorry about that. So the clinging is to a self-image that says she must exceed other people's expectations in order to be an acceptable member of society, right? To keep her job, to keep her friends, to keep her marriage. So that these two forces work together. She feels aversion towards what she thinks of as other people's excessive expectations, but she also is clinging to this belief that she must address them and she must meet them and exceed them in order to be an acceptable person. So that her lack of self-acceptance is probably much more powerful and important in that dynamic than what's happening, what other people are expressing to her. That it's difficult for her to let go of the idea that she has to meet or exceed other people's expectations. And it's difficult for her to incorporate instead a more generous and compassionate, grace-filled attitude towards herself. Right. So there's this kind of clinging aversion. What she wants is to not have other people's expectations rule her life. But what she clings to is this image that says she has to exceed them in order to be acceptable. And it's a tough place to live. So we're going to talk more about that when we come back. So we're going to take a break and talk when we come back about other ways in which this kind of grasping or clinging can take hold of our lives and can be pretty kind of almost in some ways buried, closely held beliefs about the way the world ought to be, and what some interrogation of those beliefs can help us understand and bring greater insight into our daily lives. So you're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio, and we'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Mariangela Maguire, and today we are talking about the habit of mind that the Buddhists put in the big category of desire. Desires that, though, turn on us in a way that can be quite negative. So greed, blind ambition, jealousy, clinging, grasping, wanting, always wanting, never feeling that what we have is enough, or that at the kind of a bottom line that we are ever enough, is the other side of that. So as I was preparing for this show, I noticed that the aversion show was much easier to do because I'm very aware of the things to which I have aversions, and I really don't notice as quickly the things to which I cling. And so the Tricycle editorial about how the two things are connected was very helpful to think about, of when is it that I'm in I'm noticing the aversion. And when I notice that I'm in that state of, excuse me, turning away, rejecting, being angry or frustrated with something, what am I clinging when I'm doing that? So I want to talk about some ways in which I think that this manifests in our lives that can be I don't think the experiences are subtle, but I think the thinking behind it, the kind of clinging and aversion that we're experiencing can be rather subtle. It's not necessarily what we would associate with these experiences. And I'm going to string like three different things that might seem very unrelated together to make my point. So, so this wanting, clinging mind, when we bring our full awareness to it, can we notice deeply held beliefs to which we may be clinging? So for instance, I remember the first time a friend told me about her experience of being sexually assaulted. We were in college, and her experience was what many of us have kind of been trained by mediated images to think of as the classic experience, that she was walking alone at night in the city and she was assaulted and raped by a stranger. What stands out to me, though, about her telling me about this experience and this conversation was a particular set of comments she made. She said, I think to keep me from blundering, she said, when I tell this story, I'm often asked a lot of details. She said, people often say to me, well, what time of night was it? And where was this exactly? And she said, I think what people are doing when they ask those questions is that they're saying to themselves, oh, I never go into that neighborhood, or I never go out that late, or I don't go into the city by myself. They tell themselves those things to convince themselves that what happened to me would never happen to them. So, when we talk about that experience of sexual assault, we often say the questions people ask, kind of, what were you wearing? Were you drinking? Are about blaming the victim. And I do think, unfortunately, that happens quite a bit. But I thought my friend's observation was really powerful, that another thing that's happening in our minds is that we are trying to tell ourselves that we are safe, even and despite this thing that's happened to this other person. And of course, my friend's point is that when we fall into that behavior, we're really clinging to an illusion. When we know, because we know that people, women and men and children, are sexually assaulted every day by strangers and by relatives and by friends, right? Old ladies and babies and nuns get raped day in and day out. It's both a crime of power and a crime of opportunity. And so the story we cling to, that we can absolutely prevent it from happening to us, is really just that. It's a story. And so we would ask, what's going on there with that story? What would it mean to admit that any one of us who hasn't been sexually assaulted isn't, in fact, morally superior, certainly? We're not smarter. We're not more cautious. We're simply lucky. The idea that my safety is a matter more than anything else of luck is very hard to accept. It really rocks my perception of my life to say that there's a lot here that's luck. And I may be a cautious person. Actually, that's true. But ultimately, it's luck. So here's another illusion that I think we cling to. And we've talked about this a lot in the last few weeks, in particular, the last year in this country. I think if you're a white person and maybe a middle class person especially, that we are clinging to the idea that most police officers are not capable of acting the way that the people who killed George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Tamir Rice or Dante Wright behaved, right? That they are the bad apples, they are the exceptions, they're not the rule. We tell ourselves more in that kind of clinging way about those things that happened. For instance, we tell ourselves that George Floyd and Dante Wright should have been more compliant with the police. We tell ourselves that we would have been more compliant. Of course, that doesn't fit the Breonna Taylor narrative. So we tell ourselves that we've never dated a drug dealer, and therefore the police would never associate our address with someone they were searching for to execute a no-knock warrant and then, in fact, execute us. But Tamir Rice wasn't resisting arrest, and he wasn't associated with a drug dealer. He was a child playing in a park with a toy gun. And Botham Jean was sitting in his own apartment, And Second Lieutenant Nazario, who, let's face it, is lucky to be alive, wasn't doing anything but driving with a legal temporary tag, but still ended up with his face full of pepper spray. So, what's at the heart of the beliefs about policing that white Americans are clinging to? I think it's the belief that they won't turn on us, right? That if they stop someone, that person must have done something wrong. Because to think otherwise is to think that we are, in fact, lucky. We're not smarter than the people of color who get stopped. We're not more law abiding. We're simply white. And that whiteness, because I didn't choose it, is pure luck. And I want to compare this to something to kind of try to make the point of where I think this is going and why I think this is both, in a sense, obvious, but very hard to accept. So, one of the things I've read in the last couple of years that surprised me, something I absolutely didn't know, is that the Internal Revenue Service, and it's the tax time of year, tend to go after small fish, small people who who maybe have a lot of money, but they're not super rich, but who somehow cheat on their taxes or make mistakes. They essentially go after the small fry. And they do that because the resources for the Internal Revenue Service have been drastically reduced, say in the last, 10 years, at least the last 4 or 5, I'm guessing. And that means that they can't really afford to go after people who have a lot of resources to bear, right? Who can hire a team of lawyers and, kind of keep up with the IRS in terms of generating paperwork and court cases, et cetera. So, but the IRS has a job to do, right? They can't just stop going after people who cheat on their taxes. They have to make a decision, and a rational, in their minds, I would say, decision. So they can't get more resources to prosecute people. They have to do their job of prosecuting someone. So they prosecute the people who are least able to defend themselves, because that's who essentially they can afford to prosecute. They can't afford to prosecute others. So is that what's happening with police work too? Right? Because the truth is, there's plenty of drug use among white middle class people. There's definitely a lot of domestic violence. There's actually quite a bit of bad driving, right, in white neighborhoods. But there's not the same level of surveillance or stops or arrests, right? And we have that kind of thing we say sometimes about police. I don't know if you've ever been stopped for speeding or failure to use your turn signal, and you kind of cynically say, oh, geez, it must be, late in the month and they have to fill their quota, right? We can have a kind of sneering attitude towards these, what we might call Mickey Mouse stops. Nobody was hurt. What's the problem? It's just they have to stop somebody. They have to fill this quota. I don't even know if that actually exists, but not my point. But that we, as a white person, I can have that cynical attitude sometimes about the police. So if I put that together with the idea that they have to do something, right? They have to stop people. They have to show that they're doing their job in terms of public safety. Then I really want to think about, why is it disproportionate towards communities of color? Not both the lethality of the stops, but just the fact of them to begin with, right? And so it's not just that our white privilege acts as a shield most of the time, it's that someone has to pay, right? And if it can't be us, white people, it has to be them, people of color. If you're the IRS and you can't afford to go after the super rich for tax crimes, then you go after the people who can't afford to fight back. And if you're the police and you can't and won't go after white people for minor traffic violations, for instance, then you have to go after the people of color, because you have to stop someone. And I don't know about you, but I was raised in kind of a lower middle class family, and I remember the time that my brother got into a fight, and a kid from a rich neighborhood whose dad was a lawyer punched him in the face, and there was no way anybody was going to do anything about it, because that kid had the resources to fight back and my brother didn't. And that, writ large, is happening all over this country. People who can't fight back are often the people that are preyed upon the most, whether it's in sexual assault or domestic violence or disproportionate policing of communities of color. And I think that's the thing that in terms of race that I've struggled with the most is that, I want to believe that my whiteness is a victimless crime, but there's a way in which it's not, right? My whiteness and how it's treated in this society makes victims of other people. So clinging to the belief that we were taught as children that the police are here to help us is not just for us, is that it should be not just us, but for everyone. So we cling to that belief and, that they are thoughtful, deliberate, even judicious in their actions. And yet what do we see? We see officers who are out of control, who are panicked, who are terrified, and are trying to do their job, but disproportionate in how they're doing it, and who is on the other side of their rage or their authority. So we're going to take our final break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up on this topic of clinging and asking ourselves to what do we cling, what deeply held beliefs, and how is that getting in our way of insight into the world, into ourselves and the world around us. You're listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio, and we'll be right back. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. I really appreciate you joining me today. So today's topic has been grasping, or the experience most of us have at some point in our life where we are grasping at a feeling that we really want to hold on to. It can show itself in something like drug addiction, of wanting to hold on to that high, whatever the thing that we're addicted to, and whatever the feeling is that it gives us, but really grasping it and holding on to it. And when we do that, it makes the world really shrinks down, and we don't see much beyond that thing to which we have become sort of transfixed by. So there's that kind of grasping. There's also grasping as it shows itself in things like greed or jealousy. And at the heart of those is that sensation that other people have more, that we should have more, that it's not fair that other people have more. And at the bottom of that, of course, is a real lack of self-acceptance, feeling that we, in fact, are never enough. And so we have to fill our lives with toys or experiences or people or accomplishments. And not that there's anything wrong with toys and experiences and accomplishments. But when, again, our focus narrows so much so that we can't see anything beyond what those particular things, then, that's how people become workaholics, right? That's how people become really indifferent to or cut off from their feelings and from their family and friends, because they're so single-minded in their pursuit of some particular thing to the exclusion of everything else. And that's a kind of grasping. It's a desire that's really taken a very negative spin. So as the people talk about grasping, they also talk about it as being kind of the twin of or paired with aversion. So I think that's another thing that's important to remember when you're trying to notice the habit of grasping in your own life, is to say, maybe like me, it's easier to notice the things that kind of make you mad and to which you feel aversion. So you want to say, when I'm feeling that aversion, when I'm really turning away and rejecting something, what is it that I'm clinging to in that gesture at the same time? And oftentimes it can be a sense of self, a belief, a deeply held belief. And that was kind of the last segment that I wanted to talk about, was how is it that some of our deeply held beliefs, for instance, around race and justice in our life, are really a kind of grasping at a need for security, right? Because part of grasping can also be trying to maintain and grasp onto control, right? And I want to see the world in a particular way, because if I can, then it makes me feel safe and it makes me feel like I'm in control. And those are really powerful. That's a very powerful desire, to feel safe and to feel in control. But when we do that, we often do it at other people's expense, right? So that people who, let's say, get stopped by the police must have been doing something wrong, that the police are always in the right, or they're always the good guy, and if there's a bad thing, it's a small thing. Because to say the whole system needs to be reconsidered is to say a couple of things that make us very uncomfortable. One is, it says the system that I thought was keeping me safe is inherently not keeping other people safe. And if it's keeping me safe while it's inherently threatening other people, then what is the basis for my safety? Because I thought it was the fact that I'm a good person, that I'm a good citizen, that I'm law abiding, even though we know whether it's drug use or traffic violations or domestic violence, all communities, all people are affected by all of those things, engage in all of those behaviors. It's not isolated to this or that community of color at all. There's the evidence of that is monumental. So then what is my safety based on? Is it really just the color of my skin that keeps me from getting stopped for not using my turn signal when I turn the corner? Is it really that simple? That's a very threatening idea. It's extremely threatening. It makes us very uncomfortable, and that's understandable. But I think if our desire is for insight, as well as social change, it's probably not until, as whites anyway, we can get down to that level of discomfort to say, wow, I am terrified at the prospect that the only thing between me and being treated unfairly by the authorities, whether it's the IRS or the police, is the color of my skin. That suggests a lot of need for social change and for some transformation that may be very uncomfortable to go through. And so that the clinging there is really to our idea both of how society ought to work and also of who we are and what makes us safe and in control in the world. So that has been today's. I hope it didn't sound like a sermon, but it might have, and that's okay too, about this topic and of clinging. And next week we're going to talk about this idea that clinging and aversion are related to each other, and it puts us in a state of delusion. And I think that's an important part of this conversation about, frankly, about race and fairness and justice in our culture too, is to what extent are we in the midst of a delusion about the truth, and are we not able to bring real insight to our experience because we're so committed to the delusion. So I would like to mention something today that I've been doing that I hope that you might support me in. So as I've mentioned before on the show, of course, I mention this every week because it's part of the reason I'm doing the show. I'm a life coach. And you can learn more about my work as a life coach, where I talk to people about the delusions they're clinging to and the beliefs they're clinging to and the things to which they feel aversion. And you can check my work out at maguirelifecoach.com, or you can email me at mariangelamaguire@gmail.com. And one of the things I've been doing in the last 6 months is working with a young woman, kind of pro bono. I didn't know life coaches did pro bono work, but then I started doing it and found out they do. And it's been an incredible experience. And so some friends and I put together a GoFundMe account, and you can see, if you're watching this on Facebook, Jacob's going to put up I guess it's the URL. It's the link to go to the GoFundMe account for my friend Diamond. Diamond has had some experiences in her life that I can only imagine. I have never struggled in the way that she has struggled, but she is an amazing person. She is resilient. She is strong. She is extremely intelligent. She is just extremely sharp. So if you go to the GoFundMe page that Jacob's putting up for you to see, the link, you'll be able to hear an interview that my friend Courtney Hill, who was on the show last year, did with Diamond. It's much edited down, but you get really a sense of this incredible person. And Courtney and our friend Andrew Marr and I who put the GoFundMe page together. We're trying to raise money for Diamond because she had a experience when she was in her early teens that she talks about in the interview, and she lost several teeth. And so we're trying to help her get those teeth back. And get the kind of dental care that she wasn't able to get as a child. She's now 22. This is a person who has a tremendous light that emanates from her. And I think you'll see that if you watch the videotape. And I hope if you can spare some money and contribute to her account. We're about a third of the way towards our goal of helping her get the work that she needs done for her teeth. So anyway, let's do 3 deep breaths together to round out our hour. The first breath, we're just going to focus on our breath. Second breath, we pay attention to any place we feel tension and relax. And the third breath, we set our intention for the next portion of time in our lives. So breath number 1, just focus on your breath. Breath number 2, notice any place you feel tension and relax. And breath number 3, set your intention for the next hour. What do you need? And what I hope you need is to just let go. And I hope you'll join me next week on Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio, where we will talk about delusion. And in that time, I hope you will continue to be curious about your mind and be kind to yourself. Thanks for listening to Nothing But Now on Transformation Talk Radio. You've been listening to Nothing But Now, Mindful Living with Dr. Mariangela Maguire on Transformation Talk Radio. Join me next time as we continue to practice mindfulness and challenge ourselves to change. If you'd like to find out more about my work or contact me, please go to my website, maguirelifecoach.com. That's maguirelifecoach.com. See you next time.
The music for Nothing But Now was created by Salt Theory.